So what do we have to be able to do as leaders? And you entrepreneurs know this is true if you're building a business and have been. You have to be willing to see past that initial interface with what feels like failure, that fear of failure. Failure is not absolute. Failure is not final. Failure is an experience. It's not a title. Let me say that again. Failure is an experience. It's not a title. If you fail, it does not make you a failure. One thing I tell my clients, I tell all you true drivens, you know this, we talk about this inside the program. There's only two ways to actually fail in business and life. One is to quit, to give up, to turn your back on the inevitable success that will be yours if you stay in the game, stay in the fight. Two is to What's up, my friends? JT DeBolt with you today for the True Driven Podcast, the podcast for the few, the true, the driven, those of us that we call the True Driven. And I say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, whatever time it is for you, no matter where you might be tuning in from on the Big Blue Marble. Thank you as always for joining me here. Thank you to all of our new followers and listeners. You guys can, of course, catch us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and right here on YouTube. YouTube.com/JT DeBolt. That's the channel, and that's where I'm going to be bringing lots of great content to you. Not just the True Driven Podcast, but you can catch a lot of kind of behind-the-scenes stuff, up-to-date stuff there. So make sure you're checking us over there. Give us a subscribe and a follow, and as always, appreciate the support that you're giving here to the True Driven community. This podcast, this entire movement of True Driven is designed to help those leaders out there and people who aspire to be excellent leaders to not just find that drive, but to reclaim it in many cases. It's very easy to have a measure of success in your business, have a measure of success in life. Maybe you've built a career. Maybe you've built something from the ground up. Many of you are creators. Many of you are folks who started something and then built phenomenal teams to help you get it off and keep it off the ground, keep it flying high, fast, and far. But along that path, and any real path of success, any path of anything that's significant, comes the obvious and inevitable meeting with failure, a setback. Sometimes it's a crushing defeat. Sometimes it's one of those almost life-taking heartaches that feels somewhat insurmountable, maybe completely insurmountable. There are times where no matter where you are in your path, you might be faced with the very real and, frankly, again, inevitable consequence of failure. It happens, especially when you're playing the game to win, not just playing the game not to lose. You True Drivens know this. We talk a lot about this inside the community. One of the probably most important aspects to anything of significant success. I'm not just talking about something small. I'm not talking about a little small win here or there, which, by the way, those are great. But what I'm talking about are the actual pursuits of a life worth living, a life that is beautiful, a life that is phenomenal, a life of excellence. If you are on that path, and I'm guessing you are since you're listening to this podcast and you come here on a regular basis to get a tune-up, is this. It goes without saying that there are consequences to the pursuit of excellence. There is a bill that has to be paid. And sometimes that can be a very steep fine on that path. And I say this not to sound like it's a punishment, but let's be real with ourselves and each other. Anything worth having is going to take a high level of commitment. You will interface with people. You will interface with situations, circumstances that feel like they are outside of not just your control, but also outside of your personal best interest. It feels like they're actually attacking you and coming after you. And if you allow your emotions and your feelings to rule the day, you can start to take that personal. But here's the thing. We both know as a leader, you cannot take things personal. You have to be willing to be able to detach yourself from it, to do the assessment, to decide for yourself how to best overcome all of that resistance, all of that, whether it's coming from competition, coming from another person, coming from another organization, or if it's coming from within yourself, the ability to overcome those obstacles and those setbacks. What we're going to be talking about today is the very real and frankly, again, I'm going to say the word inevitable collision that you will have with failure. So often we don't want to talk about failure, or we overindulge ourselves in this concept of the fear of failure. I will do a later podcast coming up soon on some of the bigger fears that I see leaders and especially entrepreneurs go through, but that's not what we're talking about today. I want to drill down and focus specifically on not just failure, but how to actually excel and not just succeed, but get stronger, become more capable, and refine your personal excellence through failure. The most important part, if you get nothing from this video, is this. Failure is an inevitable part of the journey to success, the inevitable part of that journey and that path to personal excellence. You will go through failure. You have to. And I'll give you a great example of this. For those of you that train, that you lift weights, you do anything athletic, and whether it's running, whether it's lifting weights, whether it's jujitsu, whether it's running a marathon, doesn't matter what it is. If you're exerting yourself, at some point you hit threshold. You hit a point where your muscles can no longer put out. That's called failure, muscle failure. Now, we don't think about it as failure. We don't think, oh my gosh, my muscles are so weak. How pathetic. We don't think of it in that sense. We think, man, I went as hard as I could go. I went to the full capability that I have in this moment, right here, right now. You go to lift that weight. You go to exert yourself to hit that PR in your run or whatever that might be. Swimming, cycling, anything that's physically exerting, you will feel a sense of failure at some point. Your body, your muscle will absolutely just say, that's it. That's all I've got. There's no emotional connection to that. There's no psychological, decision that's made in that point. Your muscle doesn't have that capacity. It just goes as hard as it can, and then it gives out. Now, you yourself may predetermine way ahead of that point of failure that you've had enough. And in that predetermination, decide to pull back. There is that. But what I'm talking about is if you didn't do that, your muscle does not have the ability to make a decision. Your muscle does not have the ability to think, feel, and then emotionally respond to something. That's just not how it works. It's a great metaphor because you can push to a point of exertion, and then pretty soon the muscle has no more left in it to continue to grow or to expand in that moment. It can't push any further. It can't push the weight, can't push your body or whatever any further. And so it lets out. That's failure. But that's failure to fatigue. What's interesting is a lot of times as entrepreneurs, especially, I'm speaking to the entrepreneurs out there because most of you are. Right? Let's just be frank. Or you're operating as an entrepreneur, meaning you have that entrepreneurial spirit, but you're working for somebody else within their organization, helping them build. You're not behaving like a true employee. You're behaving almost more like a self-directed entrepreneur inside somebody else's program, somebody else's business, which is amazing. It's an absolute part of entrepreneurship. At some point, you will fail. At some point, something that you try will not succeed. But like that muscle, it doesn't mean that the muscle is useless. The muscle, when it fails, has actually reached a point of true growth. It's the point where it becomes stronger. It becomes bigger. It can actually become more supple, more flexible. You have to hit failure in order to grow strength and size and capability for a muscle. And so it is as an entrepreneur and as a leader. One thing I hear a lot about from the entrepreneurs that I coach and train and have the privilege of working with is that they do allow themselves at times, not all and not all the time, but these very capable, high-performance entrepreneurs have a tendency to let the fear of failure stop them if not dead in their tracks, at least stop them before the point of actual failure. Now, remember what I was talking about a moment ago. You can train the muscle, and as long as you detach yourself mentally and emotionally from the training exercise itself, you can push way past where typically you probably are training at this moment. We have a tendency, the brain will actually convince us that we need to slow down. We need to pull back. It'll even tell us subtle little lies like, hey, you're about to kill yourself. Well, the brain is simply trying to conserve energy. The brain is telling you you're tired. The brain is telling you that you can't go any further because it needs energy to keep your blood pumping and your heart breathing, your heart pumping and your lungs breathing air, etc. Right? It needs the basic functional energy to maintain your body, but then it also needs energy in order to comprehend, think, process, do the stuff that you ask it to do, the higher executive functions. So the brain naturally is looking out for itself. So if you start exerting yourself, putting out too much energy physically, it's going to say, whoa, slow down. It might even do that if you're exerting yourself mentally. You probably have done this as leaders when you've got complex problems and challenges that you're looking for solutions to and you're working on. You feel tired after a long time, right? You need a break. Well, of course you do. And that's just a demonstration of how the brain thinks. It has an economy to it that says, I need to conserve the energy. So if you're putting out physically, even if you're putting out mentally, it's going to back you down well before you hit threshold, well before you have a totally exhausted gas tank. Interesting. So what do we have to be able to do as leaders? And you entrepreneurs know this is true if you're building a business and have been. You have to be willing to see past that initial interface with what feels like failure, that fear of failure. Failure is not absolute. Failure is not final. Failure is an experience. It's not a title. Let me say that again. Failure is an experience. It's not a title. If you fail, it does not make you a failure. One thing I tell my clients, I tell all you true drivens, you know this, we talk about this inside the program. There's only two ways to actually fail in business and life. One is to quit, to give up, to turn your back on the inevitable success that will be yours if you stay in the game, stay in the fight. Two is to not start at all. And the vast majority of society would take that path over the path you've chosen as a leader, as an entrepreneur, the path of excellence, the path of your own personal success, however you define that, whether that's got a financial element to it, a physical element to it, a family element to it, an emotional or a spiritual element to it. Whatever you define as success is going to require more of you than you are currently putting out as we speak. That's the reason we call it success. You're pointing at something that's bigger and more beyond where you're at currently, your current station in life. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. There's only the pure truth behind it. It doesn't mean you're not enough. It doesn't mean that what you currently have in your life isn't worth being grateful for. In fact, far from it. I had a mentor way back in the very early parts of my entrepreneurial career. He used to say, I'm grateful but not content. It's a great way of looking at it. It's a great posture to have for success. Grateful for what I have, grateful for where I'm at, even if it's in a moment of struggle. In fact, if you can convince yourself and train yourself to say that in a moment of disappointment, you will become stronger and more powerful than any circumstance could possibly come at you, that comes at you, any stronger than any of those circumstances ever could be. And here's the cool part about this, my friend. The more you start to embrace this concept that failure is a part of the journey, the less it will take you by surprise, the less it will own you, and the less power it will have over you. These are very important aspects to leadership, is the ability to make direct eye contact with excellence, knowing that excellence is yours to be had and that there will be a price to pay in order to get to that level of excellence. Let's face it, if you were already there right now, you wouldn't need to be hearing this message. There is something burning inside of you right now, something driving you to have more, to be the very best version of yourself. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. And so in saying that, we both agree we have to, you and I, that there is going to be an element of this where failure will show up. But how do we deal with that? The first part, of course, as I've been sort of belaboring at this point in the podcast, is we have to get used to the fact that it is a part of the journey. So what does that mean? That means that if there is failure, we ought not be surprised, and we definitely don't want to take it personal. Because you have failed does not make you a failure. Again, the only way you can fail, there's only two ways to fail. One is to quit, and one is to not get started in the first place. Well, clearly, if you've interfaced with failure, you don't have to worry about that second one. Most of society, they're living in that sense of failure because they will not get off the couch. They will not get out of the stands, off the bleachers, and into the field of play. They would rather sit on the sidelines and be those trolls that talk shit and criticize you for your path, for your commitment to your journey to success, to betterment, to excellence, whatever that thing might be. As a leader, you're going to be constantly getting nipped at by those critics, by those trolls. Those are the people who very likely haven't even joined the fight yet. So they've already failed. You could probably call them failures. They're going to be failures as long as they stay in that state. And of course, the other way to fail is to quit. That's a choice. You get to choose that every single day. The most important thing to remember is that as a leader, even in a high point of pain, you might be in one of those moments of extreme pain, emotional, physical, spiritual pain, where you're saying to yourself, I don't know that I can take any more of this. There is a choice that can be made right in that moment to be able to say, I'm grateful, but I'm not content. What that means is, it doesn't mean that you're happy that it's there. It doesn't mean that you want to stay there. It's okay to be stuck. It's not okay to stay there. It's okay to be frustrated. It's not okay to stay there. It's okay to be angry. It's not okay to stay there. And how we get out of that, one of the fastest shifts you will find that you make is if you find yourself in a place of gratitude for this moment of strife. Because let's be frank, there's an old saying, I don't know who said it, I have no idea who coined it, but I'm going to share it with you again. You've probably heard it before, but you're going to hear me say it at least right here, and you'll hear me say it again many times. A setback is a setup for a comeback. And so when you have something that looks like a setback, you have to take a moment and think, this is amazing. I'm actually being set up. It's as if the universe is conspiring to help me win. Now, that might be a little woo-woo for you, and that might be something where you feel kind of weird saying that. And even to me, it feels a little bit weird because it almost feels like I'm letting go of responsibility. I'm simply saying, well, thank God for the setback. Now I can actually win. That's not what we're saying. That's not what I'm even implying. What I am implying, though, and what I'm saying directly to you, is that if in a moment of frustration, in a moment of that setback, you can recognize it for what it actually is, a setup, meaning they are setting the table for you to have the opportunity, if you choose to step into that setback, embrace it as an opportunity, lean in, and go for it. A setback is a setup for a comeback, but only if you choose it. So how do we get through anything, whether it's a success or a failure? For those of you that have been going through the True Driven program, you know that one of the 6 components, one of the 6 is evaluation. One of the 6 principles and fundamentals of True Driven is evaluation, the ability to emotionally detach, use logic and critical thinking to assess the situation and extract value from it, whether it's a win or a loss. And so I'll remind you, for those of you who've been through the program, and I'll educate those of you who are new. The evaluation process is pretty simple. You look at something that worked, a win, and you say to yourself, what about that was a win? When I was talking just a moment ago about being grateful but not content, this is a great example of that. Being able to step back and say to yourself, you know what? You're right. A setback is a setup for a comeback. I just had a huge setup. That's a win. The fact that I'm in the game is a win. Sometimes that's all it takes to be able to look at the situation objectively and extract the value from it. That's a higher level of responsibility and leadership. Most people will play the victim. Most people will get all emotional and well up in their drama and their self-pity when something goes wrong, but not a true driven and not a true leader. It takes courage, it takes clarity, and it takes the ability to evaluate, to think critically in those moments, to be able to find the true value in anything, to be able to find a win even in a setback, to find a win even in a disappointment, to find a win even in a heartbreak. What about this worked? What about this could be a win for you? By the way, those can end up being some of your best practices. Those can be some of the things that you can point to and say, that is exactly what I do on a consistent basis, even in the face of adversity, even in the face of a setback. The second part, once you found what worked and what the win is what didn't work? What was the miss? Now, let's be frank. Losing is going to be a part of playing the game. There are times when you're going to lose. I hear people say this a lot. I think it's very delusional. I'll just be frank. I think it's delusional when people say, I never lose, I only learn. It's pretty damn impossible to learn if you're not willing to look objectively at the situation and say, we fucking lost. We got our asses kicked. It doesn't make you a loser. That's the most important point. You got to remember this. If you lose, it doesn't make you a loser any more than if you fail, it doesn't make you a failure. It's an experience. It's something that happened. It's not a title. It's not a role that you play. You don't play the role of loser when you lose the game. When you lose, it means you're a contender. You took a risk. You bet on yourself. You went all in on the thing, the dream, the vision, the goal, the mission. You're playing the game to win, and you came up short. Accept it for what it is. The only way to truly learn is to see that you did lose. I never lose, I only learn. Bullshit. Quit lying to yourself. Look at the situation for what it is. You came up short. What about that worked? What about it didn't work? Once you've answered those two questions, then you can go to the third of the three questions of evaluation, and that is, what might you do differently? What's the pivot? So you want to look at those. Those are the three aspects of evaluation. What was the win? What was the miss? And what's the pivot? But it's very hard to get to a pivot if you haven't taken an objective look at those first two. So many times when I'm talking to entrepreneurs, they just want to go straight to pivot. They just want to know, what do I got to do to get out of this pain? What do I need to do to get out of the failure? What do I need to do to get past the loss? And the answer is, I don't know yet. You tell me. And the only way you can answer that is by objectively getting to those first two questions. What worked? What didn't work? What were your wins? What were your misses? Or your losses? Think of it that way. It does not make you a loser when you lose. Start being okay with being honest. As a society, we seem to have lost this skill of being honest. And most importantly, being honest with ourselves. There are 1,001 fucking excuses that people make. I have ADHD. I'm neurodivergent. I have this. I have that. Bullshit. Stop fucking telling yourself those fucking stories that don't fucking help you, and start owning the fact that you executed. First and foremost, that you're in the game. 2, that you executed, and the execution 3 wasn't where you wanted it to be. So now what the fuck are we going to do about it? That's what you have to be willing to do. And I will tell you, in all the years that I've coached entrepreneurs and leaders, it comes down to basically that thought process. Now, it's not always that simple. Sometimes we got to dig deep. We got to uncover lots of layers of lots of different things to get to the root. And sometimes it's multiple roots in order to really thrive and find those wins to be able to capitalize, right? But the simple fact that you had a failure is nothing to be afraid of. Failure should never be something that you list as your big fears in life. Hey, if you fear spiders, great, fine. If you fear snakes, that works too. If you fear heights, dude, I personally don't love heights. Great. But if you're a leader and you list fear as one of your big, or failure as one of your big fears in life, We got to fix that now, because failure is a part of the process. Losing is a part of the formula. It's going to happen, especially if you're playing the game big. If you've got big visions for your business and your life, you're going to fail. It doesn't mean that you have to stay there. It doesn't mean that that's the end of the story. He or she failed, game over, end of story. The end. That's not how it works unless you choose it to be. And that's what we call quitting. And then you're right. If you quit or you don't start, there you go. You've defined it. That is true failure. Those are the only two ways. Remember that. If you experience a setback, be grateful. Be excited even. Maybe not in the moment. Give yourself a second to vent it off. Have your emotional experience with it. But then have the ability to step back and objectively look at it. It'd be great to take out a piece of paper, to be able to write things out and think through your thoughts, journal out the experience. How did we arrive at this situation? What set us up? What were the circumstances? What were the situations? How was our preparation? What was our expectation level? What was our execution level? You start thinking objectively about how things actually lined up. That's where you can find the answers to what worked and what didn't work. Once you've done that and you've made a list of those things, then you can actually go back and go, and what's the pivot? What are we going to do differently? That, by the way, is your innovations. And for all my leaders out there, if you're leading teams and leading organizations and you want the team and the organization to grow, the team and the organization to be able to overcome obstacles and setbacks, and more importantly, equip them with the skills so that they have the confidence to take the risks. They have the confidence to play big. They have the confidence to know that failure is actually an option. It can happen. And if we're not careful, it probably will happen. If we can be honest with ourselves and our teams, here's what's amazing. If you want to see the performance of your organization and the performance of your team increase, give them free rein to fail. Allow them to fuck up, not haphazardly, not recklessly, but courageously. Play the game to win. Play the game big. Play the game full out. Give them that license to do that. Also, equip them to take note of what's working as they're doing it. What didn't work if it doesn't work out. And to think deeply about what they might do differently. Give them the ability to contribute to the solution creation process, as opposed to coming to you and go, well, boss, it didn't work. What do you think? And then you doing all the thinking for them. Empower them to use these skills that I'm giving you today so that they can be the best version of themselves for you, for themselves, and for the organization. There is power in having something not work out. And again, I want to be perfectly clear on what I'm saying here. You're going to lose at times. We have to be willing to accept that. We have to be willing to see that for what it is. We have to be willing to embrace the fact that it was a loss. But losing doesn't make you a loser unless you just decide that's where you're going to stay. That's the end of the story. Failure is actually a choice. Now, you can push to failure. Your muscles will give out. You can push yourself to a point where your performance doesn't match the expectation or the necessity in order to achieve the outcome that you want. But there's really only two ways to fail. What are they? One is to quit. Two is what? To never start in the first place. So is it actually failure that you're afraid of? Is failure really a true fear? I position and suggest, and I say it with a lot of commitment and a lot of conviction, that as a leader, you really don't have the luxury of saying, I have a fear of failure. You might have a fear of success, and that's a whole nother conversation we can have for another day. Because of the responsibilities, because of the expectations, because of all kinds of things that, quite frankly, are a little bit outside of your control when you do succeed. But we're talking about this notion, this concept, this weird-ass construct that came up years and years and years ago and has propagated itself as the fear of failure. The necessity for fear in our life is to help elevate our performance, to keep us sharp, to keep us aware, to ensure that we don't do something dangerous or foolish to put ourselves into harm's way. Or if we get ourselves into harm's way, to quickly get ourselves out. The fear response is designed specifically for that. Physiologically speaking, that's what it's there for. When we start creating this mystical world that is non-existent, by the way, except for in our own minds, of this fear of failure, what are we saying? I'm afraid I'm going to fail because of what? Somebody else's opinion? Oh my gosh, is their opinion going to kill you? Is their opinion going to just stop your heart dead cold? No, it's not. That's an ego. Your ego might die. Your ego might take a hit. But failure does not define you as a failure. Failure is an experience. Failure is an outcome. It's not your title. It's not who you are, my friend. If you have gone through, maybe you're currently going through, a disappointing heartbreak, setback, frustration, a loss, step one, call it what it is. Accept that and embrace it. Step two is to recognize that there is no failure unless you quit or you don't start in the first place. So that's a choice. If you've gone that far, you can go to step three. Step three is to be grateful but not content, which means you're going to have to be able to find the value in what has happened. You got to do this in the victories too, by the way. We'll have a whole nother podcast on success at a later date. But I'm just talking about failure for now, or this concept that people keep calling, quote, failure. To be able to be grateful enough to recognize that you are in the game, that you are taking on risks, taking on challenges, looking for solutions to challenges that most people in society would never have the courage to take on in the first damn place. To have gratitude for yourself, but not content. I'm not content. I'm not going to stay here. I'm going to keep striving. I'm going to keep growing. I'm going to keep trying, innovating, putting it out there. I'm going to keep risking, challenging until. How long? The great Jim Rohn said, until. Your job as a leader is to be the kind of person that pushes the boundaries each and every single day, that demonstrates through your example of your behaviors to the world around you, whether it's the team you're leading, the organization that you're growing, or just the family that you are nurturing and developing. To be the example of what it means to want more for yourself from a place of gratitude, but also from a place of not being content, not wanting to stay stuck, to be willing to say, not only do I not quit, but I am going to start and I'm going to finish this thing. I'm going to complete and accomplish the mission. And of course, it does require that element of evaluation, the ability to, in the moment of success or a loss, to step back and say what worked, what didn't work, and then be able to use that data, that information, to come up with a pivot of what you're going to do differently. Remember, your wins, whatever you list, those are your best practices. Even if you said to yourself, look, man, we failed miserably. This thing was a huge loss, a major, major setback. If you're willing in that moment to find the small wins, those are your best practices because it showed that you stepped up, took the risk, played the game. Those are some of your best practices. Keep doing that. Do more of that. That's the answer. The answer is actually in that question. What worked? That's your answer. That's what you want to keep doing. What didn't work? Hey, now we can start thinking about things differently. We can start strategizing. We can start implementing maybe possibly different tactics or different approaches to the execution of those tactics. And those are the things, those are what we call your lessons learned, the things that didn't work. Take note of those lessons learned. They're only learned if you write them down, if you note them. If you turn a blind eye to what didn't work, you're not going to learn anything. You're going to continue making that same mistake. It's going to be painful. It's going to be painful. It's going to be painful until one of two things happens. You either pivot or you drop out. You pivot, you're a winner. You drop out, that's where failure happens. And then, of course, those pivots do become your innovations. You know, when you look at any great innovation, anything great that's ever happened, a lot of times you hear about people like Steve Jobs, for instance, who faced major failure when he was ousted by his own company and then turned around and created some of the greatest innovations. No matter what your opinion is of Steve Jobs himself, it's indisputable that the man helped create and usher in, facilitate, lead, whatever, some incredible innovations. Those innovations were bred off of noting what was working and what was not working. And then thinking creatively, thinking critically, thinking outside of the box on how to pivot out of them. You can do this exact same thing, my friend, right now. In fact, it's entirely important and required as a leader to be able to do just that. If you're going through a tough time right now, celebrate that. If you're going through a challenging period in your career, be grateful for that. But don't stay stuck in that frustration. Don't stay stuck in that moment. And whatever you do, don't see anything, whether it's a failure or a loss, as a title. If you fail, it doesn't mean you're a failure. If you lose, it doesn't make you a loser. It means you're a contender. It means that you're in the game. You're head and shoulders above anybody else who's on the sidelines, laughing at you, criticizing you, or throwing all kinds of shade at you. Fuck those people. Block them out. Don't even listen to them. The ones to listen to are the ones that are in the battle with you. Your mentors, your teammates, your compadres, the people that are there to help you take that next step, to stay in the game, to find the wins, to find the misses, and to think critically about what pivots might be necessary in order to overcome the setback. Because, as the old saying goes, a setback is a setup for a comeback. It is a gift. It is an indication that you're on the path. It is not a punishment. It is actually a reward for playing the game hard. It's an indication that you're on the path, that you need to think differently, behave differently, maybe play the game a little bit bigger, play the game a little smarter. Doesn't matter. Something does need to change, for sure. But that is a gift. See it as such. Embrace it. If it's a setback, smile. If it's status quo, that's where you got to be worried. Maybe you fell asleep at the wheel. If things are just too kind of lackadaisical, maybe it's time to dial up the focus. Maybe it's time to dial up the intensity. But in the moment of failure, setback, frustration, whatever the thing, loss, that's a moment to be able to step back. Yes, it is perfectly okay. And I highly recommend that you do take the time to kind of pull back from it for just 2 seconds to ground yourself, get your bearings, get your head on straight, get it on a swivel, and be able to detach yourself. Yeah, you can have your frustration. Yes, you can have your pity party. Yes, you can throw your tantrum, but get it out of your fucking system and get back on track. One thing especially you true drivens who I have the privilege to work with, no, that's some shit. We don't spend a lot of time in that phase of drama, that phase of pity. Get it out of your system, clear it out. Okay, now, what are we going to do about this? What did we learn from this? What were the things that helped us get where we are to this point? And how are we going to leverage that to get us to the next rung on the ladder? That's the ability to think like a leader. That's the ability to think like a warrior. That's the ability to think like a winner. And that's what's required as a true driven. Today and every single day, look at what you're doing in your business, in your career, in your life, and ask yourself, is it moving you forward? If it's not, are you too much absorbed in this concept of this fear of failure? If that's the case, drop that shit and don't ever go back to it. There is no such thing as a fear of failure because there's nothing to fear. Failure is a positive lesson teacher. I never lose, I only learn. Bullshit. You're gonna lose. Embrace that. Don't fear it. Now, don't run straight at it. Don't purposely try to lose. That's not the point either. You want to mitigate the losses that you take, obviously. It'd be great to go undefeated. That only happens sometimes in sports. Very, 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 very rarely, and almost never does it happen in leadership and entrepreneurship, especially if you're playing the game big and you're playing the game to win. You invariably will lose. But losing does not make you a loser. And failure only happens if you quit or don't get started in the first place. Evaluate it. Get back in the game. Improve. And take that next step. Climb higher, faster, and further. That's the act of a true leader. That's the act of a true driven. All right, my friends, if you got some value from this, I wanted to know in the chat, throw some comments in the chat here on YouTube. For those of you that are following on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, please share this far and wide so we can get it out to other true drivens. And remember, no matter what course you fly in life, fly high, fly fast, fly far, stay driven.